Ethan had always been skeptical of ghost stories. So, when he found a beautiful yet oddly cheap apartment near his university, he signed the lease without hesitation. The landlord, an old man with tired eyes, warned him that the previous tenant had left suddenly without explanation. Ethan brushed it off. Superstitions didn't scare him. The first few nights were uneventful. He unpacked, settled in, and resumed his usual routine. The apartment was spacious, with a cozy bedroom, a small kitchen, and an ancient yet functional bathroom. The only downside was the second bedroom, which had a locked door. The landlord claimed it was being used for storage and was off limits. At first, Ethan didn't think much of it. But then, little things started happening. At night, faint creaks echoed from the locked room. Ethan chalked it up to old pipes or shifting wood. But then, food started going missing. He'd make a sandwich, leave it on the counter, and return minutes later to find it gone. He lived alone. One night, he heard breathing deep, raspy, and undeniably human. It came from the other side of a locked door. He pressed his ear against it. Silence. The next morning, he found a glass of water on the kitchen table. He hadn't poured it. Small objects began moving on their own. His keys would disappear, only to reappear in odd places. Once, he woke up to find his closet door wide open, though he was certain he had shut it before bed. Ethan installed cameras in his living room and kitchen. That night, he woke to the sound of furniture scraping against the floor. He stayed in bed, clutching his phone, heart pounding. When morning arrived, he checked the footage. What he saw made his blood run cold. At 3:12 a.m., the locked door creaked open. A shadowy figure crawled out, moving on all fours. Its limbs were impossibly long. It reached the kitchen, stood upright, and stared directly into the camera. Then, it smiled. Ethan bolted out of the apartment and confronted the landlord. The old man sighed and revealed the truth. The previous tenant had experienced the same horrors. They had all seen the unseen roommate, but no one ever saw it leave. That night, Ethan locked himself in his room. He heard soft scratching against the door, then whispering. "I see you," it said, its voice barely above a breath. Terrified, he pushed his dresser against the door and stayed awake until dawn. Ethan refused to return. He stayed at a friend's place and called the police. They found nothing. The locked door was still locked, the apartment undisturbed. Desperate, Ethan hired a locksmith to open the door. Inside was a single chair in the center of the room. On the walls, scratch marks covered every inch. The air smelled of decay. Then, his phone rang. The call came from his own number. A whisper on the other end. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The call ended. The lights flickered. And then darkness. Ethan screamed. The next morning, his friend returned to check on him. The apartment was silent. Ethan's belongings were still there, his phone resting on the kitchen counter. The only thing missing was Ethan himself. The apartment was empty when his friends arrived. Ethan was gone. The only thing left behind was his phone, recording a final video. The footage showed Ethan standing in front of the mirror, his reflection moving on its own. Then, the screen went black. Days passed, then weeks. No sign of Ethan. Until one of his friends, Jason, received a message. A video. It was Ethan. His face pale, his eyes hollow. "Help me," he whispered, his voice trembling. Then, the screen flickered. Behind Ethan, a dark figure loomed, its fingers resting on his shoulder. The video ended. Jason tried to call Ethan back, but the number was disconnected. Weeks passed. The landlord put up another listing for the apartment. A new tenant, Alex, moved in, oblivious to the past. On his first night, he heard a soft knocking on the locked door. Thinking it was the landlord checking in, he ignored it. The next day, the knocking turned to scratching. That night, Alex received a message on his phone from an unknown number. It was a video. The same footage of Ethan staring into the mirror. But this time, the reflection whispered, "Run." Alex turned toward the locked door. It was wide open. Then, he heard breathing behind him. The lights flickered. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls. His phone buzzed again. Another message. "You're next."